PSVANE sent me in their Summit Series 6SN7 tube for review. Previously we looked at the Horizon Series tube, which I compared to some nice new old stock tubes in my Studio 6 amp behind me. Now these Horizon Series tubes cost around $54, $55 a tube, whereas the Summit Series is $169 or about $170 essentially, or $339 for a matched pair. Now the Horizon Series tube I considered a fairly neutral tube, although people tend to consider it a little bit on the warm side, which was interesting comparing, because tonally when I did try switching them around in the Studio 6 behind me, they did sound fairly similar. But for a bit of background, if you're not familiar with the Studio 6 amp, it's a headphone amplifier with 3 tubes for power rectification and a 6SN7 for gain, and the power output for the headphones through transformers is through a pair of 6V6 GT tubes. Yep, the same ones used in guitar amps, which means that you can readily switch around tubes and still get good performance from the amplifier. So using it as a gain stage tube with the Studio 6, you can mix and match, say, the 6SN7, say a brighter or a warmer or a more lively tube, with tubes with different sonic colorations in the 6V6 GT stage for some subtle coloration to one's taste. Actually, to that end, I swapped out the 6SN7 with an adapted 2C51 from Western Electric. That old classic tube is a very colourful tube and very interesting. And in the 6V6 GT slots, I had a pair of Toshibas, which worked very well in that combination. I was very happy listening with that. So switching out the PSVANE, I thought, well, I'm just going to end up switching this out, doing the review, again with these fairly neutral Toshibas in there, and then I'll be done. But actually I've ended up keeping it in there, and I'll explain why in a bit. But to start with, I compared the Summit Series tube with the good old Horizon Series. Now, while I do find them tonally very similar, I find that the Summit Series tube gives a better depth to the sound stage, and that, as a result, gives a feeling of maybe slightly more bass extension. So there's a slight warmth to the sound, but one that doesn't interfere with the, say, the mid-range or the treble. It's not quite as mid-forward, for example, as the old classic Sylvania chrome top tubes, which are very neutral, very good for mid-range focus, and very good when you want just a completely neutral tube. I actually have a pair of 6V6 GTs as well as the 6SN7, so I can make the Studio 6 a very neutral amp in that case. But sometimes I like a little bit of coloration, hence the Western Electric 2C51. I also compared it to the good old as a 2-hole VT231, because the 3-hole ones are stupidly expensive, maybe unjustifiably. It's not quite as fine detailed as the VT231, which has got a very lot of detail in your face kind of presentation. It's a little bit back from that, and that's interesting because when you can get VT231s at a good price, especially something like a matched pair, then they end up being quite the bargain if you want a lot of detail. But I did find that the detail level in the Summit Series 6SN7 was comparable with the chrome top, which is very satisfactory for me, and I consider that the standard when it comes to sound quality. But that slightly different presentation with that warmer tilt, well, I wasn't entirely happy, so I decided to do something a little bit interesting. I put in a set of warmish sounding Brimar 6V6 GT tubes. Now you'd normally think you'd try and balance up one kind of sound signature with another, but in the end, the warmer Brimars and the warmer PSVANE ended up synergizing really nicely alongside using the DCS Lena DAC as a source. And that DCS Lena DAC has a kind of heft and presence to each note. And adding a little bit of sense of bass, heft and presence with the Brimar tubes and the PSVANE Summit Series tube makes for a really nice listening combination. I ended up liking the setup which I have now with the PSVANE tube and the Brimars, and it's become a very nice listening system with very good detail and dynamics. Maybe not quite as much as I could get, say, from that good old VT231, but sometimes I have the Studio 6 in there when I don't want the most neutral sound. I want something with a little bit of presence when not all the music I listen to is one where I'm trying to pick out the superfine detail out of the music. So it's actually good to have a synergistic combination that makes me enjoy listening more so than just having a lot of fine detail, which may not always be what I want from the music. So, do you have a PSVANE Summit tube? If so, let me know in the comments how it's going in your amplifier. If not, and you decide to buy one, a pair, or a quad, consider doing so through the link in the description, which helps support this channel. Your support would also be much appreciated through Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee.